You just made $1 million at the box office, surpassing your budget and making an action comedy classic and help launch the career of one of the most famous comedians of all time. So, what else do? Do you just leave it there, or do you make a sequel? I mean, I think the obvious answer is you would just leave it there, but, when you make a lot of money, of course, let's make a sequel. But, as always, we should always see with sequels on how quality is and how it could either match or surpass the original. We all know how a lot of the times that usually turns out.
Eddie Murphy, Beverly Hills Cop 2, The Heat's back on.
Beverly Hills Cop 2 is directed by Tony Scott with a screenplay by Larry Ferguson and Warren Skaaren, and a story by Eddie Murphy and Robert D. Wachs. Film stars Eddie Murphy, Judge Reinhold, Jürgen Prochnow, Ronny Cox, John Ashton, Brigitte Nielsen, Alan Garfield, and Paul Reiser. According to IMDb's plot synopsis, Axel Foley returns to Beverly Hills to help Taggart and Rosewood investigate Chief Bogomil's near-fatal shooting and the series of alphabet crimes associated with it. Of course, after the success of the first film, a sequel would follow suit. I mean, that's usually always the case. Well, let's not dilly-dally on that. All we could just say is that's usually how it goes in most cases. And that's what we got. It's not a terrible film, but it's not even close to being on the same level as the first film. Not even close. I think that this is kind of a letdown as a whole. When I first watched it, I thought it was just average, and rewatching it again, yeah, I still think it's average. I don't think that this is a terrible, but it could have been so much better than what we got instead. But before giving my issues, here are some of the positives that I found with the film. The performances are still fun. Eddie Murphy is still hilarious as Axel Foley and commits to the spirit of what the character is supposed to be. If for nothing else, Eddie Murphy still is hilarious. He's still naturally charismatic and charming and likable as this character, but he could have easily phoned this in. Eddie Murphy could have easily, with this being a sequel, he could have just done that, but he commits. He still keeps the vibes and the feeling of what character of Axel Foley is supposed to be, and I commend him for that, because usually with sequels, you can easily get into the habit of being like, alright, well, it's a sequel, and you can say that it's the same old with the first film in his comedy, but I mean, like, that's just Eddie Murphy. That's how his comedy usually is, or at least like how it was at the time, but I still had a fun time watching him. Judge Reinhold is still dim-witted and crazy as Detective Billy Rosewood. Reinhold amps up the crazy aspect of Billy and makes the character become insane. With this movie, like, the amount of stuff that they give to Reinhold for what Billy is going through with regards to his affinity of, like, action films, but also guns, is very concerning, and even both Foley and Taggart become very concerned for him, and I think that's cool that they were able to kind of lean into the whole thing of him just even being more crazier after his first encounter with Axel, and it has now just kind of leaned him down a path of, I'm just a crazy detective, and yet I still have a job despite all the firepower I have in my house. It's just insane, but for that, I love Reinhold for kind of leaning into that part of the character. Though not in the film much, Ronny Cox is still good as Andrew Bogomil, though I will say I could have wanted more out of him. It's always nice to see Ronny Cox. Returning from the first movie, John Ashton is still curmudgeon and stubborn as Sergeant John Taggart. He may have some laid-back moments, but he still retains his demeanor of what the character is supposed to be: curmudgeon, old, and very much a stickler for the rules. But there are moments in this movie where they actually did kind of let him lean back a bit, like especially when he wears a comfy shirt to a club, and he's just trying to lay back and trying to be as cool as he can be, and that's kind of an added refreshing take for him, because I mean, they could have done the same old thing of him just always being a stickler and never learning anything, but no, he does, and I did appreciate some of the enlightening moments with him with regards to being a little bit more laid back. Both Murphy, Reinhold, and Ashton are still amazing together. No matter what, three of them work very well in the film. Hands down, they are the best aspect of this movie, and they are the fun aspect, and I have a blast watching all three of them just riff off of one another and just working together throughout this movie. I think is always a fun time. The action is exciting. The action in the first movie was enjoyable. You can kind of tell that, yeah, it was still a low budget with regards to how the action was, and I mean, it wasn't as bombastic and as crazy, but here it's amped up. Like, I'm surprised on how much they wanted to emphasize the action to being as crazy as it can be. For every shootout and car chase, it keeps the film from being stale, which I think is good, because I think this movie could have easily been as stale as it was, but thankfully the action sequences do keep it from reaching that point. The cinematography is fluent. Cinematographer Jeffrey Lee Kimball retains the tone and vibes of the first film, and the fact that it was shot in widescreen complements the gorgeous view of both Detroit and Beverly Hills, just like with how the first movie complemented both cities. This movie does that as well, but just on a widescreen feel to it. And I think all for that, I think it's a really gorgeous and well shot movie altogether. The music is good. Composer Harold Faltermeyer continues to make catchy and upbeat music that still fits the vibe of this series. It continues to be the highlight. Anytime you hear the music, it's just fun, catchy, as always, and it works well. I there's nothing more I can say about that music, because the music just fits with what I would think a movie like this could be, especially for a movie that's released in the 80s. I couldn't ask for more with regards to tone and vibe of how the movie has the music played throughout, and I enjoy it for that reason. The production is terrific. Now with a budget of $27 million, which is an increase from the last movie, it still looks of high quality. The amount of hard work along with the sets, costumes, vehicles, and props, it all looks stellar. A lot of hard work always goes into making sure that these movies, with as much as they have a limited budget, can still look as amazing as they can be. And especially with those action sequences being more amplified, it's crazy to me that it's $27 million. Because I feel like this could have easily been blown up with its budget with regards to how it can be. But for that reason, I'm still impressed that they are able to pull it off with that amount of money. Besides that, this comes off as being a generic sequel to a great film, like coming off the heels of the first movie, and that is kind of a disappointment. So now here are some of my negatives with the movie. The direction is, for me, too stylistic. Director Tony Scott brings way too much flash and style without any substance, and it does feel like a music video than a film. Like, the way he directs and how scenes kind of flow just kind of feels more akin to like a 80s commercial or a music video as a whole, with regards to the stylistic approach in which Tony Scott handles it. I mean, this man went on to make some other movies, like, before this, he had made Top Gun, which I guess you could say worked for that movie, but even still, with Beverly Hills Cop, I kind of expected a more raw take, and there just wasn't any of that. It kind of felt like a very flashy, stylistic approach to Beverly Hills Cop than the first movie did, and I don't think it should have gone that way. The story is bland. It doesn't feel like a worthy follow-up, and it just feels generic all around. It could have been so much more, which is a disappointment, because I mean, you're having to deal with this not only being a sequel, but it's like, what's the reason to bring Axel Foley back to Beverly Hills again? And with this having to deal with Bogomil from the first film and his friendship and how he was almost killed, to drag Axel back, I mean, it just kind of was like one of those things of like, what's a way to get Foley back? And it's like, not like the two cops that he's worked with, it's really the chief that I feel like, I mean, in the first movie, he didn't really interact that much with Bogomil, with Ronny Cox, and it just seems like it just felt like they needed to find a way to bring Axel into the picture, and it just felt like it was just another way of, let's make a sequel, but we need to find an excuse to get him out there. The villains are bland, just like the first film. The villains here are just stale and repetitive of every cliche villains of the 80s. If you look at so many villains of the 80s, and like, not the most iconic ones, I'm talking about the like most cliche, boring villains that you've seen in a lot of 80s or even 90s films, they're the same thing. There's nothing really different with regards to like their motivation, just money and guns, that sort of thing, or drugs. And for that, they're just not as fun as they can be. There's just really nothing memorable about them. The mayor's assistant subplot just also feels shoehorned in. It kind of reminds me a bit of the Ghostbusters 2 subplot, where I just feel like this subplot of the mayor's assistant trying to discredit Foley, Taggart, and Rosewood and their involvement kind of got annoying, and it kind of got old, and it just kind of felt like it didn't add much to the film at all. It just all felt pointless in the end that I don't think this needed to be here. And also, the third act also feels rushed. It just feels like a loud and bombastic third act that is fun, but feels anticlimactic in a way because it just kind of ends. It just kind of feels like we were starting to kind of want to build to that, but instead we just kind of rushed to get to that point and then just end the movie. And for that, I think it could have been a more memorable ending. At least like the ending for the first movie works. And it felt like the story was building up to that. It just felt like the story here was kind of playing it generically, and then once it got to the third act, it's just now balls to the walls, just going out insane craziness. And I think it could have been better. A huge disappointment compared to the first film, but it's not a terrible sequel. There's some enjoyment to be had with it, but some aspects that just to me hurt the film as a whole. And it's kind of disappointing because, again, you look at the first movie and it was such a great film. First movie had much more substance and much more rawness to it, whereas this does feel like a lot of flash and style without having that raw feeling to it. I'm gonna give Beverly Hills Cop 2 a 5 out of 10. I think it's just average. I think that this could have been a better follow-up or at least a decent one, but in the end it just kind of came and went, and there wouldn't be another one for a couple of years. And oh boy, speaking of which, I'm gonna be covering Beverly Hills Cop 3. Oh dear. Then once after that, Beverly Hills Cop Axel F. So yes, look forward to those reviews and other movie TV show reviews coming soon.